When Jennifer's Body first came out, it looked like just another teenage horror movie. It had demons, sacrifice rituals, and a stylized story about fame, obsession, and violence. At first, audiences dismissed it as exaggerated fiction, dark, but still just Hollywood imagination. But years later, people started noticing something uncomfortable. Because the core idea of the film, a group of teenagers luring a girl into the woods under the belief that a sacrifice could give them success, wasn't entirely invented. It echoed a real case that took place in California in the mid-1990s, involving a teenager named Elise Parlor. Elise was known as creative, expressive, and artistic, someone who stood out in her environment, not because she was trying to, but because that's just who she was. She went to school with a group of boys who were deeply influenced by extreme music culture and underground ideas about fame, power, and identity. At some point, those ideas stopped being abstract. What began as obsession with shock imagery and music lyrics turned into a distorted belief system, one where symbolic acts were treated as if they had real consequences. In their minds, violence became something they could justify as meaningful, even transformative. And Elise became the target of that belief. The important detail that investigators later emphasized wasn't just what happened. It was how long the idea had been developing before anything physical ever occurred. This wasn't a sudden decision. It was a progression of warped thinking, reinforced over time until it turned into action. When the case became public, it shocked not just the local community, but also the wider conversation about how influence, media, and obsession can intersect in dangerous ways. And that's exactly why Jennifer's Body feels so unsettling in hindsight. Because it takes something that should be purely fictional, teenage ritual sacrifice for success, and mirrors a real psychological breakdown that had already happened once before. The film changes details. It exaggerates elements. It turns reality into horror fantasy. But underneath it, the emotional foundation remains the same: obsession, influence, and the belief that meaning can be created through destruction. And once you realize that, the movie stops feeling like satire. It starts feeling like a reinterpretation of something that actually happened. But Elise Parlor's case is only the beginning, because the next story shows what happens when survival stops being psychological and becomes purely physical. Before we start the next chapter, please subscribe and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. Once we reach 1,000 subscribers, we can make part 2 of this video. Your support means a lot. After the psychological horror of Jennifer's Body, the story shifts completely. Now it's no longer about influence, obsession, or hidden motives. It's about survival, raw, physical, and immediate. The film Black Water tells the story of 3 people trapped in a mangrove swamp after their boat capsizes. What begins as a simple fishing trip turns into a fight to stay alive in one of the most dangerous natural environments on Earth. At first, the situation seems manageable. They are alive, together, and close enough to what they believe is safety. But that illusion breaks quickly when they realize what is beneath the water. A massive saltwater crocodile is circling them, and it is not leaving. The group is forced into a single position of survival, trapped in a tree above the waterline, unable to escape, unable to call for help, and unable to predict when the next attack might happen. But what makes the story so disturbing isn't just the presence of the crocodile, it's the duration of the fear. Hours stretch into a full night. Darkness removes visibility completely. Every sound becomes a threat. Every movement in the water below could be the moment the situation turns fatal. In the film version, characters try to maintain hope while slowly being worn down by exhaustion, panic, and exposure. One by one, the situation escalates until survival becomes almost impossible to maintain. But what makes this story even more unsettling is what it's based on. A real incident off the coast of Australia where 3 people were stranded in crocodile-infested waters for an entire night, surrounded, isolated, and unable to escape. Unlike most horror films, there is no controlled environment here. No set, no safety reset, no cut between scenes. Just real geography, real wildlife, and real consequences. And once you understand that, the film stops being about a monster in the water and starts being about how quickly nature removes every layer of control humans think they have. But even that level of survival horror isn't the most disturbing part of this collection, because the next story moves from nature to something far more methodical and far less predictable. After survival horror in the wilderness, the tone shifts again. This time, the danger doesn't come from nature or isolation. It comes from something far more disturbing, a pattern that nobody can fully explain. Memories of Murder is based on one of South Korea's most infamous real criminal investigations, the Hwaseong serial murder case, which began in the late 1980s. At first, the crimes seem unconnected. Separate locations, separate victims, no obvious link between them. But as more cases appear, investigators begin to realize something unsettling. There is a pattern forming across time and geography. The victims are found in rural areas, often after disappearing without warning. The conditions suggest a level of control and familiarity with the environment that makes the investigation even more difficult. There are no clear witnesses, no consistent suspect, and no reliable forensic system capable of quickly identifying answers at the time. What follows is one of the largest criminal investigations in the country's history, involving thousands of officers, endless interrogations, and massive pressure to find a breakthrough. But instead of clarity, the case becomes more confusing. False leads begin to stack up. Confessions are sometimes obtained under pressure, only to collapse later under scrutiny. And each time investigators think they are close, the trail goes cold again. The film captures this frustration, not just the search for a killer, but the psychological toll of chasing something that never fully reveals itself. And what makes the story even more disturbing is that it doesn't end with resolution. For decades, the identity of the real perpetrator remained unknown, leaving behind not just victims, but unanswered questions that lingered long after the investigation slowed down. That uncertainty is what made the case so influential, because it showed something uncomfortable, that even with thousands of investigators, massive resources, and years of effort, some cases don't resolve neatly, they just fade. And that sense of unfinished reality is exactly what Memories of Murder captures so well. But the next story removes ambiguity completely, because this time, survival isn't delayed. It's decided in seconds. After years of unanswered questions in a criminal investigation, the tone shifts again. This time, there is no mystery about what happened, only the scale of it. Society of the Snow is based on the 1972 Andes flight disaster, one of the most extreme survival situations ever recorded. A chartered plane carrying a rugby team and passengers crashes deep in the mountains, far from civilization, in freezing conditions with no easy access to rescue. At first, survival feels temporary. There are survivors. There is wreckage that can be used as shelter. There is hope that search teams will arrive quickly. For a short period, that hope is enough to keep people going. But that hope slowly collapses. Days pass, then weeks. The search effort is eventually called off. The group realizes they are completely isolated in one of the harshest environments on Earth, with freezing temperatures, altitude sickness, and almost no food supply. What follows is a gradual breakdown of survival conditions. The environment does not change, but the human body does. Energy runs out. Decisions become harder. Basic survival instincts begin to take over in ways that are difficult to comprehend from the outside. The film doesn't focus on action in the traditional sense. Instead, it focuses on endurance, how long people can remain alive when every external system has failed them. And what makes this story globally known is not just the crash itself, but the decisions the survivors were eventually forced to confront in order to continue living. It's a scenario where there are no clean choices, no easy moral framing, only necessity, time, and the limits of the human body under extreme pressure. Unlike the previous cases, this is not about a killer or an unknown force or an investigation that goes cold. Everything is visible, everything is known, and yet it still feels almost impossible to process. Because the real horror here isn't surprise, it's duration. The idea of surviving not for hours, but for months inside a frozen environment that offers nothing back. And just when it feels like survival horror has reached its most extreme point, the next story shows what happens when survival isn't in the wild anymore, but in open water, where there is nowhere left to stand at all. After surviving frozen mountains and impossible endurance in the Andes, the final story moves again. But this time, there is no land to climb, no shelter to build, and no escape route to reach. Only open water. The Reef is based on a real 1983 maritime disaster off the coast of Australia, where a small fishing vessel capsized in rough seas, leaving its crew stranded in the Coral Sea. At first, survival feels possible. The water is warm. The group has makeshift flotation from debris. They are still together, still conscious, still able to move. The initial assumption is simple. Stay afloat, wait for rescue, survive long enough to be seen. But the ocean doesn't stay predictable for long. As time passes, exhaustion sets in, currents shift, distance from land becomes impossible to judge. And then comes the most important factor of all, what is already in the water with them. Sharks begin to appear, not immediately in attack, but in presence, circling, observing, testing, the kind of behavior that turns uncertainty into constant psychological pressure. What follows is not a single moment of violence, but a slow breakdown of control. The environment itself becomes hostile, not just because of the animals, but because of fatigue, dehydration, panic, and isolation. One by one, the group is reduced by circumstances that no longer feel manageable. Every decision becomes reactive instead of planned. Every movement carries risk. And unlike survival on land, there is no direction to run, no distance that guarantees safety, no barrier that separates them from what is underneath, just water in every direction. The story becomes less about confrontation and more about inevitability, how long a human body can function when every survival option is removed except endurance itself. Eventually, only one outcome remains possible. Either rescue arrives in time, or it doesn't. And what makes this case so disturbing is not just what happens in the water, but how quickly normal reality disappears once control is taken away by the ocean itself. Because when you remove land, structure, and time, all that's left is survival against something you can't outthink. And that's where this collection ends, not with monsters or fiction, but with real events that were later turned into films because they were too extreme to forget. But even these aren't the only stories where reality became horror. Some of the most disturbing cases were never fully adapted at all.